I never intended to get involved in something so dark, so twisted. But curiosity has a way of pulling you into things. And sometimes, once you're in, there's no way out. Let me start at the beginning. I'd been browsing the deep web late one night, the kind of mindless scrolling you do when you're trying to distract yourself from the world around you. Nothing in particular was on my mind. Just looking for something new, something strange. I had always been intrigued by the dark web, the hidden corners of the internet where anything could be found, from illegal activities to bizarre communities that defied explanation. One website caught my attention. The name was cryptic, just a string of numbers and letters, no different from hundreds of others I'd seen before. But something about it felt different. It wasn't flashy, no pop-up ads or overly colorful links. The design was basic, almost too basic, like it had been abandoned for years. But it felt like I'd stumbled onto a relic of the past, something forgotten, something that should have stayed buried. I clicked on it, thinking I'd probably just get redirected to some random, obscure forum. Instead, I was greeted by a simple message. You're almost there. Enter the password to gain access. A password? I didn't think I'd come across anything that required one on the deep web before. This was new. But then again, that was the whole appeal of the deep web. Nothing was ever predictable. I checked the source code of the page to see if there were any clues hidden in it, but I found nothing. My mind raced, trying to piece together what this might be. The curiosity gnawed at me, so I did what anyone would do in this situation. I Googled it. Password for hidden chat room. What I found next was something I'd never expected. A Reddit post from several years ago, long buried and barely noticed. The post was short and cryptic, just a series of words that made no sense at first glance. The dead chat room. Enter only if you want to know the truth about your death. Death predictions. Only for the brave. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling a strange mixture of fear and excitement. It was like the internet was daring me to take a step further, to peel back the curtain and see what was behind it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, but before I could overthink it, I typed in the password I had found hidden in the post. Eternity. With a deep breath, I hit enter. The screen flickered for a split second before loading a new page. This one was different. It was a chat room interface. Simple, bare bones. There were no pictures, no emojis, just a long list of usernames. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, each one consisting of random letters and numbers, almost like some kind of code. I scrolled through the list, wondering if anyone was even online, when I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. One of the usernames had my full name. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. How could someone know my name? I didn't recognize any of the other usernames, but this one, it had my name in full. My first and last name, exactly as it appeared on my ID. Before I could wrap my head around it, a message popped up in the chat. Welcome. You found us. We've been waiting. I froze. Who were these people? How did they know about me? But the fear was quickly replaced by something else. A morbid curiosity. I couldn't look away. I had to know more. I typed cautiously, unsure of what to say. Who are you? The response came almost immediately. We are the ones who see. We know the truth about your end. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands trembled as I typed again. What do you mean? What do you know about me? This time the reply took longer, and I could feel my anxiety building with each passing second. Then the message finally appeared. You're here because you want to know. You want to know when and how you will die. We can give you that, but beware. Once you know, there's no turning back. I hesitated. My heart pounded in my chest. This was insane. But at the same time, the thought of knowing my future, knowing when my life would end, was too tempting to resist. I wanted to hear it. I had to know. But before I could type anything, another message appeared. You've made the choice. Are you ready for the truth? I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to feel. But before I could stop myself, my fingers hit the keys. Yes. And then, nothing happened. The screen stayed frozen for several long seconds, as though the chat room was deciding what to do next. My pulse raced. I felt like I was on the edge of something, teetering on the brink of a reality I couldn't quite comprehend. And then, just as quickly as the room had gone silent, a new message appeared. Your death will come in 2 weeks, 3 days, and 14 hours. The how? That's for you to discover. My stomach dropped. My hands went clammy, and the world around me seemed to blur. I sat there staring at the screen, unable to process what I had just read. The words kept repeating in my head. Your death will come in 2 weeks, 3 days, and 14 hours. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest like it was going to explode. Was this a joke? Some kind of sick prank? But it didn't feel like a prank. It felt real. The kind of real that you can't escape, no matter how hard you try. Before I could compose myself, another message appeared. Time is ticking. The countdown has started. We will see you soon. And with that, the chat room went dead. The screen went black. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of everything. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. I didn't know if I had just stumbled upon something real or if it was all just a sick joke. But I had made a decision, and now there was no turning back. The countdown had begun, and I was already in too deep. I wish I could say that after that night, I closed my laptop, deleted my history, and walked away from the whole thing. But the truth is, I couldn't. The message had burrowed itself into my mind like a parasite, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, it clung to me, gnawing away at my thoughts. The next few days were a blur. I went about my routine like usual, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every second felt like it was leading me closer to some inevitable, horrifying conclusion. I was constantly checking the clock, counting down the hours, the minutes, the seconds. It's hard to explain the feeling, but it was like being trapped inside a room with no windows, knowing that the door was locked, and there was nothing you could do to escape. Every time I looked at the clock, I could feel the weight of the chat room's prediction pressing down on me. I couldn't stop thinking about the message, and soon I started seeing things that weren't there. At first it was subtle, a flicker in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting across my room when I turned my head. I brushed it off as exhaustion, or maybe just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it started happening more frequently. The shadows became more defined, and I began hearing whispers, faint, distant voices, like someone was speaking to me from just beyond the edge of my hearing. I knew what it was. I wasn't imagining it. It was the dark web chat room's presence, its power, its reach. It was like the countdown had triggered something inside me, and I couldn't escape it. One night, 3 days after receiving the message, I woke up in a cold sweat. The whispers had gotten louder, more distinct, and I could no longer ignore them. They weren't just random voices anymore. They were calling my name. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and checked the time. The countdown clock in my mind had ticked down another few hours. Only a week and a half left. I had to know more. I had to find out if the chat room had any more answers, or if it was just a sick joke, playing on my paranoia. I couldn't help myself. I opened my laptop again and logged into the chat room. The dark web felt different now, as though the air around me had thickened with each keystroke. The screen loaded, and there they were again. Those strange usernames, those cryptic messages. But something was different this time. One of the usernames had changed. It no longer contained random letters and numbers. This time it read, "I know you're scared. You can't escape now." I froze. The feeling of dread that washed over me was immediate, like a wave crashing down on me, drowning me in a sea of fear. My fingers trembled as I typed a response. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The reply came so quickly that it almost startled me. "We are the ones who see, the ones who know, and we've been waiting for you. The countdown will reach its end, and you will be ready to face what's coming, but there is still time to learn." I didn't know what to think. My pulse was hammering in my ears and my throat felt tight. I couldn't tell if this was some twisted game or something far more sinister. I was losing control. I needed answers. "What do you mean by learn? What am I supposed to do?" The response came again, this time slower, almost like it was savoring the moment. There is one way to break the cycle. If you want to stop the countdown, you must face the thing that you fear most. Only then will the time stop ticking. Only then will your death be delayed. But beware, there are consequences for trying to change what is meant to be. I sat there staring at the screen, the words echoing in my mind. Face the thing you fear most. I didn't know what that meant. I was terrified. But at the same time, a part of me wanted to believe that there was hope, that I could somehow outsmart this twisted fate. What if the chat room wasn't just predicting my death but offering me a way out? What if I could face my fear and change everything? But how? What was my fear? And if I tried to face it, would it truly stop the countdown, or would it only make things worse? I typed again, my mind racing. What is the thing I fear most? How do I face it? The response was chilling. You already know. It's always been with you. You cannot hide from it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I reread the message. The fear that had been lingering in my chest for days now grew stronger. What was it? What was I supposed to face? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that whatever it was, it had been there all along? I sat back in my chair, my mind whirling. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like I was being drawn into a trap. Was I really willing to face whatever this was? Was I truly ready to confront my deepest fear? The chat room went silent after that. No more messages. I was left alone in the dark, with nothing but my thoughts and the growing dread that something was coming for me. The countdown was still ticking. Every minute that passed, I felt the weight of the prediction pressing closer, drawing nearer. The whispers grew louder, the shadows around me darker, and every time I looked at the clock, I felt like the seconds were slipping away too quickly. The fear gnawed at me. What was I supposed to face? And would it be enough to stop the countdown? One thing was certain. Whatever was coming for me, it was real. And I was running out of time. It had been a few days since my last exchange in the chat room. The countdown was still ticking relentlessly, and with every passing moment, the pressure grew unbearable. I tried to go about my days normally, working, eating, socializing, but it was like there was a thick fog surrounding me. My mind was consumed by the chat room, and everything I did felt meaningless, a mere distraction from the inevitable. I had to know more. The cryptic messages, the countdown, and the constant whispers in my ear. It was too much to ignore. I had to confront whatever I was supposed to face. I spent hours combing through the dark corners of the chat room, trying to find any clue that could lead me to the source of my fear. The usernames had grown more twisted, more erratic. Messages flashed on the screen, disjointed phrases that felt like they were meant for me but made no sense. It was as if the chat room itself was alive, feeding off my growing paranoia. Then one night, as I was scanning through the messages, I saw something that stopped me cold. "You remember it, don't you?" The words were simple, but they struck me like a bolt of lightning. My heart skipped a beat. The fear in me surged. I remember it. I stared at the message, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I didn't understand. What was I supposed to remember? What did this chat room know about me that I didn't? The screen flickered. Then another message appeared. It's always been there, right in front of you. Your fear is not a thing of the past. It's a part of you. The clock is ticking, but it won't stop until you face it. I felt my pulse quicken. The words made something inside me stir. I wanted to scream, to close the laptop and forget about it all. But I couldn't. I couldn't turn away. The chat room had me in its grip, and I needed to know. In that moment, a memory surged to the forefront of my mind. A memory I had buried deep down, one I had long forgotten. It was from when I was a child, barely 10 years old. I had been with my family on a camping trip in the woods. I had always been an adventurous child, and I loved exploring the surrounding forest. But on this trip, something had gone terribly wrong. It was late in the afternoon when I wandered away from the campsite. I had always been curious about the deep woods, the parts that felt dark and forbidden. My parents had told me never to go too far, but I didn't listen. I ventured deeper and deeper, the trees growing thicker around me, the sun's light barely filtering through the canopy above. And that's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was something else, something dark and twisted. It was a figure. Its outline was vague, its features distorted, but its presence was suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body froze in place as I stared at it, paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, it just watched me. I recoiled as the memory hit me full force. The fear, the darkness. It was all coming back, flooding my mind in a rush of panic. I typed frantically into the chat room. "What is this? What was that thing I saw in the woods?" The response came almost immediately. "You know what it was. You've always known." My mind was racing, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of it. The figure in the woods had been my fear. The chat room had made me face it, pulled it out of the depths of my subconscious and brought it to the surface. But why? Why now? What was the connection? The countdown was still ticking. Each second felt like a blade slicing closer to my throat. The more I thought about that shadow, the more I realized that it wasn't just a memory, it was a warning. That thing had been a harbinger, a symbol of the death that awaited me. But why had I seen it? Why had the chat room brought it back? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? I stared at the screen, the darkness closing in around me, the whispers in my ears growing loud. The chat room paused for what felt like an eternity. Then the reply came. "You must go back to the place where it all began. Face the shadow in the woods. Only there can you break the cycle." My heart raced as the words sank in. Go back to the woods? I couldn't even think about it. The fear that had haunted me for years, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my sight, was still fresh in my memory. The thought of going back to that place made my stomach churn, but the chat room had made it clear. This was the only way to break the cycle, to stop the countdown. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was terrified, but another part of me felt a strange pull, a compulsion to return. It was as if the chat room was guiding me, pulling me toward the darkness that I had once escaped. The next day I packed my things. I couldn't tell anyone what I was doing, not even my closest friends. No one would understand. They'd think I was crazy if I told them about the chat room, about the shadow, about the countdown. I couldn't take that risk. As I drove toward the woods, my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What if the shadow wasn't just a figment of my past? What if it was something more? And if I confronted it, would it stop the countdown, or would it lead to something far worse? The sun was starting to set as I reached the edge of the forest. The trees were taller than I remembered, their twisted branches casting long, dark shadows across the ground. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I parked my car and stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. My footsteps crunched in the gravel as I walked toward the path that led deeper into the woods. With each step, the feeling of dread grew stronger. It was as if something was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I kept walking, deeper into the woods until the familiar clearing came into view. The spot where I had seen the shadow all those years ago. The place where I had run in terror, never looking back. But now I wasn't running. I was going toward it, seeking it out. I stood in the center of the clearing, looking around. Everything seemed the same, but different. The shadows were darker, thicker, and the air was still. The faint whispers from the chat room seemed to follow me, like they were coming from the very trees themselves. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn around, to leave, but I knew I couldn't. Not anymore. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A movement, a figure. It was just a blur at first, but then it became clearer. A shape, tall, thin, and cloaked in darkness. Its eyes were the only thing visible. Two glowing orbs, staring at me from the depths of the forest. The shadow. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was here, just like the chat room had said. It had returned, and it was waiting for me. The figure took a step forward, and I could feel its presence like a physical weight pressing down on me. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The whispers in my ears grew louder, more insistent. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get away, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. The figure took another step, and then another. It was getting closer. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to force myself to move, to escape, but I was rooted to the spot, and then finally it spoke. You came back. Its voice was low, distorted, like it was coming from the depths of a well. It wasn't just speaking to me, it was speaking to my very soul. You cannot escape. I felt a surge of panic. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from this thing. But as I turned to run, I felt something icy cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down, and there it was, a tendril of darkness wrapping around my leg, pulling me back toward the shadow. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the forest, by the darkness. I was being dragged toward it, unable to fight back. The tendril tightened around my ankle, pulling me closer to the thing that had haunted me for so many years. And then it whispered again, "It's time to face your fear." In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about the shadow. It was about me, about my own fear, my inability to confront it all these years. The shadow was just a manifestation of everything I had run from, everything I had buried deep inside. And now I had no choice but to face it. The world seemed to warp as I was dragged closer to the shadow. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I couldn't. I was caught in its grip, a force too powerful to resist. My heart raced faster than ever before, and the icy coldness creeping up my leg felt like it was seeping into my very bones. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, more desperate. The chat room's cryptic messages echoed in my mind. It's time to face your fear. But how could I face something that had haunted me for so long? Something that was more than just a shadow. It felt like my entire life had led to this moment, this point of no return. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg for help. But I couldn't. The fear was too overwhelming. Every breath felt like I was choking on it, suffocating in its grip. The shadow moved closer, its dark form shifting and warping like smoke in the air. Its eyes, those glowing, empty eyes, pierced through me, and I felt my very soul being torn open. There was no escape. There was only the shadow. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to croak, my voice barely more than a whisper. The shadow's lips twisted into something resembling a smile. "Because you invited me," it said, its voice sending a chill through my entire body. "You called me when you ran away, when you buried your fear deep inside you, and now it is time to pay the price." My mind was spinning, struggling to process the words. I invited it? How could I have invited this nightmare? I was just a child when I first saw it. I didn't want any of this. But as the shadow's words settled in my mind, I began to understand. The fear I had buried, the fear I had refused to confront all these years, it had been feeding this thing. It had been growing stronger with every moment I tried to ignore it, every time I pushed it down. The chat room hadn't been lying. It had shown me the truth all along, even when I didn't want to see it. But what did it mean to confront the fear? How could I fight something that felt like it was part of me? Something that had been with me for so long? The shadow inched closer still, and I could feel the tendrils of darkness tightening around my ankle. "You can't escape. You will never escape. But you can make a choice." A choice? What choice did I have? It was too late to run. There was nothing I could do. The countdown clock was ticking away in my mind, getting closer to zero. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to my own death. "You can face me," the shadow continued, its voice growing deeper, darker, "or you can remain in the darkness forever. You can let your fear consume you, and I will claim you. Or you can let go of the fear, step into the light, and break the cycle." I didn't understand. Let go of the fear? How? It felt impossible. I had spent my whole life trying to control my fear, running from it, pushing it away. But the shadow was right. It had always been there, waiting. And now it was demanding that I face it. The shadow's tendrils wrapped tighter around me, dragging me further into its abyss. I felt like I was being torn apart, my body and soul warring against each other. But I knew that if I didn't make a choice, if I didn't decide right now. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. It seemed to hesitate, as if it wasn't sure what to do next. I felt a surge of power, a new sense of control. The fear was no longer in control of me. I was in control. "You are mine," the shadow hissed. But it was no longer confident, no longer menacing. It was fading. With one final defiant step, I reached out, and the shadow dissipated into nothingness, vanishing as though it had never been. The air around me felt lighter, the suffocating pressure lifting. And then, everything went quiet. For the first time in years, I felt free. The countdown clock in my mind stopped. The dread that had been following me for so long was gone. The chat room, too, was silent. It was as if the entire nightmare had just ended. But I knew better than to think it was truly over. The shadow might be gone, but the fear would always be there, lurking in the corners of my mind. And as for the chat room, I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped it or if it was still watching me, waiting for the next time I would be vulnerable. The countdown had ended, but I knew I had to remain vigilant. There was always more darkness to confront and more choices to be made. I thought I had escaped it. The shadow, the chat room, the fear, it all seemed to vanish when I confronted the darkness within. But as the days passed, I began to notice something strange, something that I couldn't explain. It was the smallest things at first. I'd glance at my phone, only to find the screen blank, as if something had wiped all my apps clean. I would open it, thinking I was imagining things, but there, right at the top of the screen, was the notification that would make my blood run cold. The chat room has a new message. I froze, staring at the notification. The chat room. But it couldn't be. I had faced it, hadn't I? I had let go of my fear, banished the shadow. It was over. But then why was it back? I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering over the screen. I had promised myself I would never look at it again, that I would leave it all behind. But curiosity, no, fear, compelled me. With trembling hands, I opened the message. "You thought you could escape." The words sent a jolt of panic through me, and I felt the cold grip of the shadow closing in again, even though I couldn't see it. There was something far more sinister about this message than anything I had seen before. It wasn't just the shadow talking, it was the chat room itself. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. There was no going back now. If I ignored this, I knew it would consume me. There was no avoiding it any longer. "You can't escape fate," the message read, before another followed it almost immediately. "Everything you've done has led to this. The cycle will never end." A chilling realization gripped me as the words sank in. This wasn't just about the shadow or the chat room, or even my fear. This was something deeper. The cycle wasn't just a nightmare, it was part of something far darker. The chat room had never been an entity of the physical world. It wasn't something you could confront and destroy. No, it was part of something ancient, something tied to fate itself. It was then that I understood the true purpose of the chat room, the shadow and everything that had happened. This wasn't a random occurrence. The chat room had been there for a reason. Its messages, its warnings, its predictions. They were part of something far greater than I could comprehend. The deaths that it predicted weren't just coincidences. They were part of a cosmic plan, something that I had unknowingly been swept into. As I stared at the screen, my hands beginning to shake uncontrollably, I felt a pull, a familiar sensation, the sensation I had felt when I first entered the chat room. The cycle was about to begin again. I closed my eyes, trying to fight the overwhelming sense of dread that flooded through me. The chat room had always been a reflection of my deepest fears, but now it had evolved into something else. It wasn't just predicting death, it was shaping it. And if I wasn't careful, it would consume me just like it had consumed so many others before me. The message on my screen changed again. "You're not alone. Others have come before you. They made their choices. Now it's your turn." And then, in an instant, The chat room filled with messages. Hundreds of them, all from people who had faced the same thing I had. Each message was a thread, a story, a warning. As I scrolled through them, I saw names of people I had never met, their messages speaking of fear, regret, and the same fatal decision I had been faced with. Each person, just like me, had faced the shadow. Each one had made a choice, but none of them had truly escaped. They were all trapped in the cycle. We all face the same end, one message read. The chat room will always find us, no matter how far we run. The shadow never leaves, another one warned. It's a part of us now, just as we are a part of it. It hit me like a ton of bricks. The chat room didn't just predict death, it controlled it. It shaped the lives of those who had encountered it, guiding them to their ultimate fate. And now I was part of its design. My death, my fate, had already been written. But the question remained, could I change it? Could I break the cycle? Or was I doomed to repeat it, just like everyone before me? I had a choice to make. I could continue to let fear control me and succumb to the chat room's power, allowing it to dictate my fate. Or I could face the reality of what I had become, a participant in a never-ending cycle. I could accept that I wasn't just the victim. I was the cause of it all. The shadow wasn't an external force. It was my fear, my choices, my actions. It had been part of me from the beginning, lurking in the dark corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the chat room, the predictions, the warnings, they were just reflections of that same darkness. I stared at the screen, the endless flood of messages blurring before my eyes. I couldn't run anymore. It was time to confront the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. The